So I'm going to very briefly introduce our speaker so we can get right to that. Michael Lindsay is the 8th president of, first of all, I'm Doug McRae. I'm one of the partners here. Matt Kane will come up after Michael has spoken and introduce some of the other folks here. And you'll get to know a little bit more about Compass Ion, the folks that invited you all here. I want to thank you all for coming. Back to Michael. He's the 8th president of Gordon College, having taken that post in 2011. I graduated from Gordon College a few years ago, and that was not a funny line. And it was my great pleasure to get to know Michael personally last summer when we shared a meal together. I do not remember exactly how this came up, but in the course of our time together, Michael asked me this point-blank question. He said, "You didn't get into any trouble when you were at Gordon, did you?" Now, not knowing if he had any inside information, I had to confess to one particularly disruptive prank I pulled that got me suspended for one day during my sophomore year. To tell the whole story would take valuable time away from our speaker, but in short, we got about 4 inches of snow one evening, which is nothing in Massachusetts, but it was enough to make believable all the official-looking signs that everyone saw when they first woke up saying class is canceled due to snow. The signs were very effective, but it got my three accomplices and I in a lot of trouble. I'm a reformed prankster now. I have not been caught since then. But enough about me. We're very excited to have Dr. Lindsay here with us tonight. He's originally from Jackson, Mississippi, which he will not be saying you all tonight. He graduated summa cum laude from Baylor with a BA in English and Speech. Fellow Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Baylor University. She's also, his wife, Rebecca, is also a published author and educator. Michael and Rebecca have 3 daughters, Elizabeth, Caroline, and Emily. Being a man who has raised 1 daughter, the fact that you are raising 3 and still have a full head of hair makes me respect you all the more. Prior to pursuing his Ph.D., he served as a consultant for religion and culture at the George H. Gallup International Institute in Princeton, where he co-authored 2 books with George Gallup Jr. He earned his Ph.D. in sociology from Princeton. From 2006 to 2011, Dr. Lindsay was a member of the faculty at Rice University, where he directed the program for the study of leadership. In 2006, he was named the most promising sociologist under 35 at the World Congress of Sociology. In 2007, his book, Faith in the Halls of Power, was published. He received a Pulitzer nomination and was listed in Publishers Weekly's Best Books of 2007. He has recently completed the Platinum Study, a comprehensive research project that explores the personal, moral, organizational, and social factors that sustain leaders of major institutions in our society. Through in-depth interviews and quantitative analyses, the project represents the largest and most exhaustive set of interview data collected with senior leaders. Over 500 business, government, higher education, and nonprofit leaders participated in the study, including 2 U.S. presidents, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, and presidents of some of the world's leading universities. His work has been profiled in hundreds of news outlets worldwide, including New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, Fox News, and the BBC. Welcome, Dr. Lindsay.
So it's a great privilege to be here tonight, and what I hope to do is to share with you some of the insights that I spent collecting data over 10 years, looking at the lives of these extraordinary people. And the title of my talk is The View from the Top. What I'm hoping to be able to do is to lay out for you what we would call the leadership challenge. Institutions of higher learning are always trying to think about how they can develop the next generation of leaders. And at Gordon, where I serve, that's also one of our priorities. And it's interesting because our leaders have never been more pressed than they are today. And there's never been less confidence in our leaders than there is today. And so what I want to share with you is the insights that I learned over the last 10 years talking to a variety of people about what makes for really effective leadership, as well as some of the common pitfalls that I encountered along the way. One of the interesting things is that in professional life today, we tend to reward people who are specialists. You master a particular area and you're promoted. But as you move up into organizational responsibility, the span of control widens. there are not nearly enough opportunities for young people to learn what it means to be a generalist in orientation as opposed to just a specialist. And so one of the things that you really need to think about are how do we develop the next generation of young people, and how in our own lives do we develop the aptitudes, the abilities to be able to address a broad range of issues. I learned this lesson from an interview with General Colin Powell. I don't know if any of you have spent time with him. He is a big man, large, imposing figure. I met him at his office in Northern Virginia. We sat around a small conference table, about the size of this table. And General Powell sort of leans into your space. And as we're talking, at the very beginning, he said, "Michael, I know you sent me this material, and it was interesting about your project. And I just got to tell you, upon reflection, I think the whole project you're working on is pretty much worthless." That was the opening paragraph of our conversation. Fortunately, I had the presence of mind to simply say, "Well, that's very interesting, General. Say more." And for the next 5 minutes, he proceeded to sort of berate me. He said, "You know, you make the case that this particular fellowship that I had when I was in the White House was significant, but actually it was just one among many years. It wasn't particularly pivotal in my life. And then everybody's trying to figure me out, and I'm not a laboratory rat. And even if I were, who's to say that my experiences and my journey would be representative of other people? How can you necessarily apply it to a wider group of people?" And in the whole process, I think what you're really trying to do is point to the secret ingredient, and there's no secret ingredient, and there's no one person who's made all that big a difference. And frankly, I just think in the whole framework, everything that's written about leadership is pretty much worthless, and I can't imagine you would do something that would be really meaningful. And I'm not really sure even why we're here today. After about 5 minutes of that, I said, "You know, General Powell, it's so interesting, and I appreciate very much what you're saying. And I'm just wondering, how do you reconcile what you're saying here with what you wrote in your autobiography? Because I seem to recall that you talked about your relationship with Frank Carlucci as being a turning point." And he said, "Well, it was one of many turning points." And I said, "Well, if I might, General, it seems to me it was a very significant turning point, because Frank Carlucci took a real personal interest in you, really as a young military officer. You worked directly for him when he was in the Nixon White House. And then if I recall correctly, when President Reagan was elected in 1981 and he selected Carlucci to be the National Security Advisor, I believe it was Carlucci who handpicked you to be his deputy. And then in 1985, when he stepped down from that position, there were many people vying to be National Security Advisor, and many people within the White House had ideas of who should get that position. But Carlucci was the one who spoke up and convinced Ed Meese and James Baker that you should be his successor against many other competitors. And then I believe that as a result of that, folks felt like you had enough policy experience, so it was obvious for you to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which happened during the Gulf War. Most people say if you had not had that practical experience in the White House and formed the relationship you did with George Herbert Walker Bush, that you wouldn't have had the chance to make those relationships. And then most people say there's no way that you would have been chosen as Secretary of State if it had not been through the relationships you formed with the elder Bush, and then having that practical experience working both in the White House and at the Pentagon. So as I look at your career, it seems to me the relationship that began with Frank Carlucci wasn't just a turning point, it was the turning point. It changed your life. He said, "Well, maybe you got a point." Colin Powell was exposed to leadership at the very highest of levels as a relatively young man. And through that, he developed a generalist orientation to leadership, which is actually required. One of the key things that we need to be doing is to helping young people to get experience, not just in a particular small area, but actually exposing them as widely as possible to the challenges that you face when you're leading something at the top. Sometimes you get that through a mentoring relationship. Other times you get a big break by working as a special assistant for someone in a powerful position. But every one of us, in our own ways, have learned what it is to make the transition from being a specialist to having a much wider perspective. And that is what's required for leadership. One of the things that I learned over the course of interviewing these amazing people, we collected so much data. Every hour-long interview, we did 20 hours of background research. We transcribed every hour-long interview and then coded it along a variety of variables. We coded it along about 550 quantitative variables, about 150 qualitative variables. I had 20 members of my research team produced 5,000 pages worth of data, just file drawers after file drawers of information. And the information ambush is something that's common for everyone who ends up moving into positions of leadership. And different people respond in different ways. This is John Whitehead. John Whitehead served as the head of Goldman Sachs and then was Deputy Secretary of State. One of the things that he learned that's important, if you're leading a large enterprise like Goldman or like the State Department, you need to stay in contact with lots of different people. So every day, he holds an hour of meetings that are broken up into 15-minute segments, 4 meetings of 15 minutes each. He calls them standing meetings. People come into the room and they don't take a seat. And he intentionally chooses different groups of people who meet with him in those 4 groups every day. So it's a variety of different people at different parts of the organization. And that's how he gets a pulse of what's happening within the firm. George Shultz served as Secretary of State under President Reagan. Before that, he was the CEO of Bechtel. Many people credit him with being the person who really made the most strategic difference in helping to broker the variety of conversations that happened between Gorbachev and Reagan and really ending the Cold War. When I went to interview him he has a beautiful penthouse apartment overlooking San Francisco. I went in there and was asking him, how did you make sure to keep sort of focused on the long-range strategic goals? Because one of the challenges when you're in a leadership role is to be overwhelmed with the daily activities. Minutia can just overwhelm you. And he said, every Tuesday and Thursday, I made an appointment with myself. The only person who could interrupt me was my wife and the President of the United States. And for 45 minutes, I sat on my couch in my office and had a yellow legal pad. And I made a list of what we were doing for the long-range goals. And he said that bi-weekly briefing with myself, where I would pause to look at the big questions and figure out what are we doing, was a way in which I could make sure that I wasn't just focusing on the objective for today, but I was thinking about what's the objective for 5 years from now. One way or another, leaders have to figure out how to handle all of the information that's coming at them and also how to manage the long-range strategic goals. This is Donna Shalala. She served as Secretary of Health and Human Services for 8 years under President Clinton. Secretary Shalala developed a system whereby she basically chose one executive assistant who filtered all of her information, her email, mail correspondence, telephone, everything, and that person became a real conduit. Now that has a great advantage in that you've got one person who helps you amass a lot of information. When that person gets sick, it's a rough day in the office. And so you have to figure out how you can manage the information ambush. What we're finding is that people in positions of responsibility have more data and more information than they possibly can process in a given day. On average, the people I interviewed had between 100 and 150 emails every day. At the top was a guy named Bob Dahl, who at the time was the chief equity strategist for BlackRock. He got about 800 emails a day. I also learned that the view from below is often the least obstructed. Max Dupree, the longtime CEO of Herman Miller, the manufacturer of office furniture, taught me this. And he learned that it was really important for him to spend a portion of his work week walking the factory line, because he found that folks would ask him questions. And sometimes they asked questions that nobody else in the executive suite would ask. For example, one day there was an elderly man, an older man who worked on the factory line, and he said, you know, Mr. Dupree, I'm just wondering, you know, how I'm going to make ends meet, and I've been thinking about, I'm very grateful that I got the raise a couple of months ago, but kids going off to college, trying to make things happen. He said, I just don't know how to do it. I'm not sure how to make it happen. And then in this sort of unguarded moment, this factory worker, in a very unassuming way, asked the question basically of how much money do you make, Max Dupree? Now that's not a question we generally ask the CEO. And he said, in that moment, I was embarrassed to answer him. He said, I realized that I had built a corporate culture that wanted to encourage a sense of community, but there was a moment when I was really uncomfortable with the differential between my pay and his pay. And so he made a very unusual decision in that he decided he would tie his annual salary to that of the lowest paid employee, and he would be paid 20 times that person. Now 20 times, you say, well, that's pretty good. Understand that the average differential between the lowest paid employee in corporate America and the CEO is 453. Pretty dramatic. The view from below is often the least obstructed. I also think it's really important in the process of leading to make sure that you find the right people. And this is the mistake that most managers make. we tend to hire people who are like ourselves, when in fact you need to hire in a different way. This is Thad Allen. Thad Allen served as Commandant of the Coast Guard, and he's a really rough and tumble guy. He was arrested twice over the course of his career. He's not the kind of guy that you would think of as being sort of the refined military leader. But I tell you, the Coast Guard, the Coasties as they're called, they loved him. They loved him because they really identified with him. And he's a very effective leader. In fact, in the aftermath of FEMA and Katrina in New Orleans, the federal government chose him to be the point person. And he basically salvaged a lot of the work that was occurring in New Orleans. So much so that when the BP Deep Horizon spill occurred, the federal government brought him back, and he was the point person for that because he knew everybody in New Orleans and they trusted him. He taught me something very important, and he said, oftentimes when you're looking for people to come and work with you, it's important that you focus on complementary strengths, but also in the process, a shared commitment. Now, what he means by that, complementary strengths, shared commitment, is that it's really important in the process of developing your leadership that you not just hire somebody who replicate your existing strengths, because that's not going to shore up anything. But it's very important that you have a shared sense of vision. Because if you don't have people that believe the same thing, who don't have the same values, who don't have the same orientation, it's going to be a really frustrating experience. It's important to make sure that you hire the right people in the process of leadership. I also found that the most effective leaders are folks who lead with what I would call they lead with their life. That they embody the values that are really important to them. When that does not happen, it's really problematic. This is Bernie Madoff. I only have to say a name, and you know the irony about embodying values. And that's actually what I found. That far more important than what a leader says, far more important than actually what he or she does, it's the extent to which his or her life reflects the values of the firm he's leading. Really important. Embodiment is something that means that you really have to lead. It's a 24/7 sort of identity. If you had told me 5 years ago I would be a college president, I would have said you're crazy. At the time, I was a sociologist at Rice, really enjoying the work that I was doing. And I thought that at some point in time, college administration might be a place where I could serve, but it was not something I was expecting at that moment. And then, through a series of providential turns, I ended up making the move to Gordon. And the first day on the job is when I learned the importance of this embodiment. We live in a house that's owned by the college that's on the campus. One of the nice things about being a college president is that you're sort of, you're working really close to where you live, and you live really close to where you work. And my wife and I, we gotten up that morning, and we were having some cereal watching the Today Show. It was about 7:15, and we're in the kitchen. And the way our house is designed is it's really, really spread out. My predecessor is a guy named Judd Carlberg, and his wife describes the house as sprawling like an awkward teenager. And that's pretty true. So the kitchen is really, really far away from the bedroom and different things like that. And we're sitting there, and, I was not dressed for the day, wearing shorts and a T-shirt, and eating my cereal. And immediately we see this fleet of vans that come up the driveway to park. And they're people, and they have these signs, physical plant. And it was my colleagues who work at the college who were helping to get the house finished up for us to move in. And it was like an army of like 20 people who've shown up at 7:15. Well, I'm not dressed at this moment, but I can't figure out how to get back to my bedroom without passing the front door. And Rebecca, my wife, neither was dressed. And so we're suddenly realizing that we're going to have to take this sort of leading with our lives a bit more seriously. And that's actually what I found across all the people that I interviewed, that the life-work balance, I don't really know that balance is the ideal, but to the extent you have to figure out how to make that work, it's especially true when you're in a senior leadership role. And so there's lots of people who came up with creative ideas. One of the things that has impressed me along the way is the important role of role models early on in our lives. And I found that actually statistically, it really doesn't make a lot of difference in what somebody does between the time that they're born and when they head off to college or early college. So up until 18 or 20, there's no statistically significant relationship between one of the variables of their life and whether or not they go in to be a senior leader or not. It doesn't matter if you played t-ball as a kid. It doesn't matter if you were captain of a football team. It doesn't matter if you were student body president. It doesn't matter if you make good grades. There's no significant relationship. However, something happens between about age 20 and 40 that the people who rise up to senior leadership have a catalytic experience. Sometimes it's in a leadership development program like the White House Fellowship, which is what Colin Powell had. And other times it's getting a big break, working on a particular project at the firm, and somebody takes an interest in you. Sometimes it's a matter of getting into a really competitive graduate program that creates opportunities, but you have to have something that sort of sharpens the angle of your trajectory. And then after about age 40, it's interesting, most people find that they don't really have a mentor that's still interested in them. That there's something in our culture that we like the idea of helping somebody in their 20s or 30s, but once they're 40, they're on their own. And so, for some of us, that means our day has come and gone. But it also shows the really important role that you can have in somebody's life at that formative stage in their career, and a catalyst. I also found that in the course of this developing a lifestyle of leadership is that families feel the pressure even when the leader does not. This is Bill Roper. Bill Roper is an extraordinary man. He's the only person alive who has been both the chairman of the dean of a school of medicine and a school of public health. You think that those two worlds would get along, but actually they rarely do. And within academia, they don't have a lot of resonance. But Bill Roper has been the dean of both the School of Medicine and the School of Public Health at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Before that, he served as the director of the CDC in Atlanta, Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And he told me an interesting story. He said, you know, Michael, I had a young son at home when I was running the CDC, and I was working crazy hours, but my wife and I had figured out a plan, and I thought I was doing such a great job to be involved in my son's life and for him to feel like he knew what was going on. And we had a ritual where every morning he would come out, he would follow me when I got into the car, I'd wave goodbye, and that was just part of our routine. And he said, and then one day I got into the car and I rolled down the window, and my 3-year-old son said, "So thanks for visiting us, Daddy." I said, man, just cut to the heart. My own son sees me as a visitor in my own home. That kind of experience actually was relatively common in the interviews I conducted. Fully 1/3 of the people I interviewed wept at some point in time in the hour-long conversation. First time that happened, I sort of freaked out. You know, they don't teach you what to do in grad school when somebody cries in an interview. And then the second time it happened, and third time, I was trying to figure out, what is it that's causing these people to sort of break down in the middle of an interview? And I found it occurred in response to a single question. Has your professional success ever cost you something personally? And people could tell stories about broken relationships, failed marriages, strained relationships with their kids, and lots of challenges. The good news is that we're talking a lot more about how we integrate our lives as whole people. So there's a lot more that's going on these days than there was 20 years ago. And sometimes it can be simple as making pancakes or waffles on a weekly basis. Steve Ellis, who is the head of, John Donahoe is the head of eBay, and he has a practice where every Sunday morning they make pancakes at his house. He makes them, and that becomes part of his family ritual. Ralph Larson, the CEO of Johnson & Johnson, made a practice of having Sunday night pizzas, and that was their family ritual. One way or another, people who figure out how to have these regular rituals in their life as a way of normalizing family life, there's a way in which they can create some kind of continuity. I also looked at how it was that these very prominent leaders built a legacy of influence that was far beyond just individual policy decisions or making a particularly profitable year. And one of the most profound ways of influence occurs through moral authority. This is David Grizzle. David Grizzle served as the senior vice president of Continental Airlines in the late 90s. He changed the way we fly. You see, in the late 90s, David Grizzle had this very creative idea that Continental, which was a smaller airline, might build a partnership with Northwest Airlines, another airline company, where they would sell seats on each other's planes. Even though they were competitors, they would work together. And they would also build a relationship so that their frequent flyers would earn mileage credit on each other's planes, and that elite status would be reciprocal as well. It was an industry-changing deal. The consolidation that we are seeing in airlines today, where basically Continental has merged with United, Northwest has merged with Delta, and now American is going to merge with US Air. You know what? It all started with this guy, David Grizzle. In the late 90s, Wall Street loved this idea, and the stock price of Continental went through the roof. At the end of the year, David, because he had brokered this deal, was entitled to a very large executive bonus, as were most of his colleagues in the executive suite. And yet David is a person of deep faith, and he was really interested in using these additional dollars to try and advance some humanitarian causes through an organization called World Vision that he believes in very much. But it bothered him to think that he was going to have to pay taxes on these dollars, and so he's going to lose less, and he'd rather the money just go straight to the charity. So he thought, I wonder if there's a way in which I could actually give back my bonus to the company and then use the company's philanthropic arm to give the money directly to World Vision. Normally, Continental would never give money to World Vision, but he thought this might be a way in which it could occur. So he went to go see the general counsel. Well, general counsel had never heard of an executive who wanted to give back their bonus. He had to go consult lots of law books to find, how do you handle this? But sure enough, there was a way in which they were able to do that. But here's the interesting thing. After David did that, and he had figured out how he was going to basically give his $2 million bonus and make it go through the corporate philanthropy, he then went around and used that as a chance to try and persuade his colleagues. And so, one by one, he goes and knocks on the door of every other executive who was getting a bonus at the end of the year. And they all knew that they really owed their bonus to the work that he had done. So he had enormous moral authority. So he'd go up and say, Doug, you really don't need that extra bonus this year. Don't you want to do something great? You could give this money back, help a charity, you'll look great, the company will look great, and you'll do a lot of good. That year, the executives of Continental Airlines gave away collectively $7 million of their bonuses. Moral authority. What I found is that the people are able to bear witness to their values and their principles most often by what they're willing to give up. That in a sense of sacrifice, in a sense of sort of giving up what other people think that you have coming to you, that becomes the most potent form in which you can show off the things that are important to you in your values. I also found in the process of looking at this that it's really important for you to think institutionally but act personally. There's a wonderful book, a small book written by a professor at George Washington, Hugh Hecklow, called On Thinking Institutionally. And basically, Hecklow makes the argument, which I think is indeed right, that if you look at our culture today, individuals really do not change society, but institutions do. And the way institutions change is through individual people. People who are placed in the right area. This is Colleen Barrett. You may associate Southwest Airlines with the iconic CEO, Herb Kelleher, swashbuckling kind of guy, hard-charging, hard-working, smokes a lot, drinks a lot, and is rough and tumble. The interesting thing is that the corporate success of Southwest Airlines has much more to do with Colleen Barrett, who served as president under him, than it does with Herb. The reason is because Colleen was the softer side of Southwest. She was the one who said, we don't need an HR department, we need a people department. We don't need to come up with a list of rules for our frontline ticket agents to follow. Instead, we need to empower them to make the decisions to try and satisfy our customers. She literally said, we need to make love at the heart of our corporate culture. And so they took the heart and LUV and made that the identity of Southwest Airlines. Through that, Colleen got enormous moral authority. In fact, it was interesting because when I was doing the interview, she was actually moving out of her house. She had a big house, and she said, I'm downsizing, but I can't move just yet. And I said, why not? And she said, well, I've got this thing that I've got to do. I'm ready to move into my condo, but I can't move there just yet. And I said, is something wrong with the condo? And she said, no, I've got this party that I need to have at my house. And I said, what's the party? And she said, oh, it's silly. And she kept trying to put it off. And finally I said, what is the party? She was hosting the wedding of a flight attendant who had asked if she could get married in her backyard. I said, well, do you know this flight attendant? She said, no, not really. And I said, well, how did she come to ask you? And she said, well, we're the kind of company where people can ask favors of one another. And I didn't want to disappoint her. So she continues to live in this house for 2 extra months while she's waiting for this woman's wedding to occur. Think institutionally, but act personally. I also found that the most formative influence of developing leaders really comes through a line of mentoring chains. That I could actually trace one generation after another of mentors who had made a real difference. For example, Dick Neustadt was a professor of government at Harvard. In the late 60s, he built a program where young enterprising leaders could come and study at the Kennedy School for basically a year. And he recruited a young man from Atlanta named Vernon Jordan. He recruited Jordan because he thought he had a lot of promise. And in the process of that, Dick Neustadt had been going to a meeting called the Bilderberg Group. It's a meeting that's held every year. Only about 150, 200 people show up. It's one of the most selective invitations you can get. Heads of state are there, a few CEOs, a few academics, and they meet in different parts of the world. Dick Neustadt invited Vernon Jordan to go to that, and in the process, they became really good friends. In 1991, Vernon Jordan, who had been going to the Bilderberg Group for a number of years, decided that he would bring the guy who was, at the time, the governor of Arkansas to join him. Now, when he said he wanted to bring the governor of Arkansas, the people at Bilderberg said, give me a break. Arkansas? You got to be kidding. He said, no. I think this guy's got a lot that's going to make a difference. In fact, I think he might be president of the United States someday. Well, as it turned out, the relationships that were formed through Bilderberg and other networks ended up being quite catalytic for President Clinton's career. And you can actually trace the mentoring influence that came from Dick Neustadt to Vernon Jordan, so much so that Bill Clinton says he owes his presidency to that man. Another interesting story. This is John Mendelsohn. John Mendelsohn was a decent student, undergraduate at Harvard, who decided that he wanted to transfer from chemistry to biology. The spring of his sophomore year, he went to the biology department and said, I'm going to be here in Cambridge for this summer, and I'd love to do research for a faculty member. Is there anybody who I might be able to do some work for? And the secretary said, give me a break. It's April. No way. I mean, everybody's already filled up the slots, and I'm afraid you're not going to be able to do anything. Well, one of the things that I learned about these great leaders is that they're quite persistent. And so a couple of weeks later, he came back and he asked the secretary, has any new faculty been hired since I came here that might be coming here who doesn't yet have a research assistant? And she said, well, actually there is. There's this young guy named Jim, and he'll be starting in the fall, but I think he's looking for some research assistants to work this summer. Turned out, John was able to get a job working for Jim. Jim wasn't just any old Jim. It ended up being James Watson, as in Watson and Crick, the two guys who mapped the double helix of DNA. While he worked for James Watson, he developed a real passion for the way in which scientific research, particularly medical research, could make real advances. He was inspired so much that he devoted his career to trying to help cancer using basically the realm of genomics to address personalized cancer care. And so, in 1996, he went to be the CEO of MD Anderson Cancer Center. And when he was installed, he said, I owe it all to an assistant professor of biology named Jim. Mentoring chains. I found it across hundreds of people who have been influenced by scout leaders, by Sunday school teachers, by coaches in high school who made a really significant difference. I also found that many times great leaders encounter the institutional inertia of big organizations, that they're immovable and they don't know how they're going to actually overcome it. And this is what really blunts people. Many people say that you move into the White House, President of the United States, most powerful person in the world, and it's then you realize you actually have very limited in what you can do. It was interesting because I interviewed Mike Duke, the CEO of Walmart, and he spent 30 minutes telling me just how constrained he was as CEO. I said, you employ more people than anybody else in the private sector. And he said, yeah, but you've got all of these constraints that are on you. Institutions have this enormous inertia that makes it really difficult to move. And so in the process, you have to figure out how can you get things done. The way you get things done is through the strength of what we call weak ties. Mark Granovetter is a social scientist who wrote a book of that title in the early 1970s. He was trying to trace how it is that you and I get a job. Many people assume that the way that you get a job is by calling your college roommate or a family member who knows somebody and puts in a good word, when in fact, that's not how it happens in most cases. Instead, most of us get jobs through acquaintances. Weak ties, people that we know, friends of friends, other people who have connections. And actually, that's what I found is how real institutional change occurs. One leader in a particular organization connects with somebody else who's a friend of a friend, and they're able to do things together. Weak ties are far more powerful in getting legislation passed, in having corporate policy changed, in mergers and acquisitions, in getting a job, in building a company. The strength of weak ties. I want to close with the story of a man named Kien Pham. Kien Pham, in 1977, fled his native land of Vietnam. He and his family floated on a boat, this boat, in fact, in the South China Sea for 3.5 months. He then was transferred into Thailand, and eventually he resettled in Colorado. And he enrolled in CU Boulder, speaking practically no English. He didn't know how he was going to acquire English, so he decided that he would start going to the lectures that they had after class, and he would just listen to people and see if he could pick up on some words. And one lecture that he went to one day was by a man named Tim Worth, who at the time was the congressman for the Boulder area. And Tim Worth told the audience about his own professional life and how he moved into government and politics, and talked about the formative role of this organization I mentioned earlier, the White House Fellowship. Kien Pham listened to that and thought that sounded sort of interesting. So the next year, he decided to apply to be a White House Fellow. Well, he didn't have a very competitive application, so he's rejected. It's one of the most competitive, in fact, it is the most competitive fellowship in the country. 3,000 people will apply each year. Somewhere between 12 and 18 people are selected. It's more competitive than Rhodes Scholarship, and you've probably never heard of it. It's been around since 1965, started by President Johnson, and has been a very important catalyst in the lives of many people. But, as I mentioned, great leaders have grit and resilience, and so he decided to apply a second year and was rejected. He applied a third year and finally was selected, and in 1985, he's shaking hands with President Reagan. It's an amazing American dream story. In the course of 8 years, you go from on the South China Sea in 1977 to shaking hands with President of the United States. After that, he ended up going to Stanford Business School, became a very successful executive. Today, he owns the wireless rights for most of Vietnam, and so he's doing quite well, and has had a very successful career. It's interesting because over the course of his career, he stayed in touch with Tim Worth, that congressman who he heard speak at CU Boulder back in the late 70s. After a couple of terms in the Congress, Tim Worth decided to run for Senate, and he became Senator Worth. And then in 1994, he was selected by President Clinton to become our Undersecretary of State for Global Diplomacy. One day in 1998, Kiem Pham decided to pay a visit to Secretary Worth at his office at the State Department. And he said, Tim, I don't know what you know much about Vietnam, but there's actually a group of about 4,000 political prisoners that are being held in Vietnam and have been held since the end of the war in the 70s. What are you guys doing to secure the release of those prisoners? Tim Worth said, gosh, Kiem, we've been trying. The Vietnamese government doesn't really participate. Pete Peterson, who's our ambassador, he tries all the time to make things work, and we just haven't had any success. Kiem Pham said, I've got some contacts over there. Would you be willing to let me be an emissary to try and see if we could do anything? And I need a little bit of help. Would you send a cable to Pete Peterson, the ambassador, and basically tell him to try whatever I propose, and let's just see if it works? He said, sure, we'll do that. And so Kiem Pham traveled back to Vietnam, and he worked with some contacts within the government to see if he could secure the release of one of those prisoners. And he did. And so then he went to the ambassador and he said, I want you to hold a press conference to praise the Vietnamese government for being so generous, so magnanimous, and thanking them for making the right decision. The ambassador said, we don't do that. Are you kidding? It's one prisoner. If we were talking about 100 prisoners, maybe, but one, no way. Kiem Pham said, I've got the cable from the secretary. Let's see what we can do. And so Pete Peterson decided he would hold a press conference, and it was covered in the newspaper. And it was sort of interesting because the Vietnamese government suddenly was a little warmer to the Americans that were there. About 2 weeks later, Kiem Pham went back to his contact to see if they could secure the release of a second political prisoner. He was successful. He went to Pete Peterson and said, I need another press conference. He said, again? Yeah, let's try it. They went through this routine about every 2 to 3 weeks for a year. The ambassador had more press conferences that year than he had in his entire career, and he was praising them for securing the release of one prisoner. After this had gone on, about actually 18 months or so, Kiem Pham said, I think the timing is right. He went to his contact and asked if he could get a meeting with a couple of other people. And he said, we're coming up on the New Year celebration of the new millennium, the year 2000. In some places, they call this the year of Jubilee. It's supposed to be a really big deal. What if we stop going about this retail and we decide to go about it wholesale? I'd like us to see, could we secure the release not just of 30 or 40 political prisoners, but all of them, the whole lot? Well, they weren't sure about that. They thought about it, talked, negotiations went back and forth. But right before New Year's Eve, they released all of those political prisoners. An unbelievable feat. I asked Kiem Pham, I met with him in Washington. I said, Kiem, what got you interested in doing this? He said, well, I haven't told a lot of people, but the truth is, there's really been one person on my mind. He said, I would go to sleep at night when I was out on this boat. And as I was floating in that South China Sea, there was one man I just couldn't get out of my head. I asked him about this picture. Told you it was on the Today Show. It's a big deal. Immigrant, comes to America, comes to work in the White House. And I said, what are you thinking at that very moment? You're shaking hands with the President of the United States. He said, actually, I was thinking about that same guy that I had thought about on the boat. He said, in fact, when I went to my contact, the Vietnamese government, I was interested in what we were doing, but I really had this one man on my mind all the way through from 1977 to 1999. I said, who's the man? He said, my uncle, who is at the bottom of that list and who walks as a free man in San Francisco today. Over the course of my research, I found that the view from the top can be very surprising. I call it leadership that's working not just for your own interest, but also for the common good. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. It's fantastic. We're grateful that you took time out of your busy schedules to be with us. And if there's any lesson that we're reminded of to walk away with tonight, it's that the who matters more than the what and the how. And a couple of my mentors are in the room. I won't embarrass them right now, but they taught me that. They taught me that people matter more than product. They matter more than process. And so I want to take just a minute before we jump into some Q&A. Our clients and our guests tonight are eager to pummel you with questions tonight. You created a lot of curiosity and sparked some real great conversation that we want to have with you tonight. So we're going to take about 10 minutes. Before we enjoy some food and some wine together, we want to ask some Q&A. So let me do this real quick because there's a lot we could take on a night like tonight to tell you about Compass Ion. I think the best thing to do is to show you who Compass Ion is. And so let me just introduce the folks that are in the room. We have 16 employees now. We've grown a ton just in the last 2 weeks. So I'm going to ask our client support and advisory and principals, I'm going to ask you guys to stand as I call your name because there's many of you here in this room that call in looking for, I know I heard this story from my good friend George Limbach, who's in the back. He said, he picked up the phone one time and he said, "Hi, Sally, nice to talk to you." He said, "I'm not really interested in talking to you, George. I want to talk to Jody." So our clients tend to like our support team a whole lot more than they like us, which tells you a lot about who we are. So I would just ask our newest employee, Caitlin Baird, could you stand and just hold your applause until the end. Our newest mother in the firm, Cassandra Queen, could you stand up? I'm so glad you were here tonight. Justin Harvey joined us last year. Thank you, Justin. And Jody Vos, who I will pause. She really was the muscle behind this event tonight. She's a great host. Thanks, Jody. And so Dan Soderberg, could you stand, please? And Ben Doherty and Josh Manifold. Is Pat with us? I walked in late. I didn't see Patrick. Who else am I missing there in terms of advisors? Okay. And I'd like my principals to stand. George, could you stand for us? George Limbach. And Doug McGray here in the front. And then Jim Baird, who's our founding principal, and actually this year is our 20-year anniversary of Jim having the courage to venture out from a management role with a very large, very profitable position to launch this entity and really was the first step to us becoming independent. So just receive them with a warm round of applause. Thank you, guys. So, Michael, if you'll join me back up here, you're wireless, so please roam around, and if somebody asks a really bad question, just go sit next to them. Make them extremely uncomfortable. But just ask that you raise your hand, and because we don't have a portable mic, we do have a portable mic. I'll go ahead and pass that. I'll go ahead and pass it if you raise your hand. So the gentleman here in the front, go ahead.
I've been locked on Common Cause and International Baccalaureate curriculum the last few days on the internet. What can you tell us about that?
The IB program is an incredibly impressive college-bound program, very selective. It's the most challenging secondary curriculum that's in the world. It's become the global standard for the very best students. We have students who go through the IB program before they come to Gordon, and they're some of our very best students. The International Baccalaureate is a recognized global standard for very, very high achieving students who have to complete a core curriculum of rigorous classes. They have to do a variety of projects and papers, have to do some synthetic work. It's like taking AP courses on steroids. It's incredibly competitive, incredibly demanding, and the IB program is offered at some of the finest schools in the world.
And Common Core?
I don't know Common Core. I'm not familiar with Common Core. Many institutions have a Common Core curriculum, but I don't know a program called Common Core.
couldn't help but notice that most of your contexts were political in such a tough political atmosphere we have now. How difficult was for you to build your leadership portfolio with so many different people with such different political ideologies?
Well, it just so happens that the people that I've put in the presentation are that actually the political framework is a minority. So I had about 250 CEOs. About 150 were Fortune 500 CEOs, and then folks from private companies and different things like that. So the private sector was probably more represented than the public sector. But one of the things that I really tried to look at are commonalities among these different people. And it looks at change over time. So I included people who went all the way back to President Johnson's administration, all the way through President Obama's administration. Some 9 administrations, lots of different sort of experiences, and was trying to look at those connections. A lot of people ask me, how did you get these interviews? I mean, it's really amazing. It is, I will say, it's amazing. It actually started as my doctoral dissertation. I'm living proof you can write a dissertation that your wife will describe as actually interesting. I started out hoping I might be able to do 40 interviews, and it was so hard in the beginning. I mean, I really tried hard, and the first 10 or 12 were just very, very slow, and I was very selective because I was trying to get the right kinds of people. But I had a big break when I got the interview with Mike Duke, who's the head of Walmart, and then President Carter gave me an interview, and then shortly after that, James Baker, Secretary of State, gave me an interview. And then, man, I dropped their names left and right, and it worked. And I went back to my dissertation committee, and I said, I've done my 40 interviews, and I'm ready to write. And they said, well, are there other people that you've been contacting who've granted you an interview but you've not conducted? And I said, well, yeah, there are some. And they said, well, who are they? And I started naming some of the people, and they said, oh, that's so interesting. Go back, do some more interviews. So I went back into the field, and I got to the 100 mark, and I did 100 interviews. And so I came back to them, and I said, okay, I'm ready to write. Here are the people. And this woman on my committee, she said, are there others that are out there that you're interested in? And I said, yes, there are some other people. Well, like who? And so I named a couple people. Oh, you need to go back, do some more. And so we went through this several times. In the end, I stopped at 360. I said, you know what? I got enough. And ended up writing that. And then after doing that, I went to Rice, and I learned that the largest interview-based study that had ever been completed in the history of social science was done in 1970 by a team of researchers at Columbia called the American Leadership Study. And for that, they interviewed 545 people. And so I thought, I'm already at 360. Another 200, and it's done. And so I thought, well, let me just see what I could do. And so I began doing some more interviews, getting a chance to do some more folks. And then I was in the middle of sort of wrapping up this project, but I still had a number to go. And I got this opportunity to come to Gordon. I remember one night I got into bed with my wife, and I said, Rebecca, I've been doing these interviews for a long time, but the goal was to get 550. That was my golden number I was trying to reach. Really, 546 is all I cared about, because they had done 545. But 550 sounded nice and even. And I said, but I think I've got like 90 to go to get there, because I had to throw a couple of interviews out because they didn't match up. And so I said, I'm not really sure. This was in January. And she said, well, you're going to finish this project. You've been working on it all our married life. And I was teaching Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at the time. And I was living in Houston. And things were getting more serious with Gordon. And I thought I might get this job. And the appointment would begin in July. And I knew that once I moved into this job, I wouldn't be able to do more interviews. So I actually started every Tuesday and Thursday, I flew out to do interviews. So I would fly to big cities. I'd fly to New York or Chicago or LA and try and do 3, 4, or 5 interviews in a single day. It was very, very challenging. And then I'd fly back, I'd teach my classes, and then I'd fly back out, do another 4 or 5 interviews, then I'd fly back home. And I did that week after week. And I ended up doing my 550th interview. It was about 2 weeks after I started the job at Gordon, but it was in Boston. It was with Drew Faust, the president of Harvard. So it was a nice way of sort of bringing things together and gave me a chance to meet some amazing people. Did I call Guinness? No. We've got my publicist is working on it.
Did you have a Guinness?
Yeah.
I'll just without you.
Sure.
A question that I didn't maybe understand
Yeah.
Then in your mentoring piece, you talked about younger people.
That's right.
I'm a teacher, or was a teacher, and I see mentors as critical.
Absolutely. So mentoring is the single most important variable. The catalytic event where people draw upon their mentors the most happens when they go off to college or shortly thereafter. So the key thing, if you're trying to be the hard-nosed social scientist to say, when does that mentoring really pay the dividend? It occurs actually after they leave high school. Many of them have formed that relationship that's been there, and many times they become like second parents, have that kind of relationship. So it's really important for those to be developed, but they actually bear fruit as folks move into their 20s. Hold on, I think the mic's coming to you.
Michael, first of all, to reiterate our heartfelt thanks on the part of not just Compass Ion, but all our clients and friends here for sharing the fruits of all your labor with us.
Thank you.
It's not only fascinating, it's critically impactful. My question for you goes back to early on in your talk, and if I'm misquoting this, forgive me, but I think you said something to the effect that leadership has never been so challenged or pressed, and yet there's been such little confidence from the broad populace. My two questions surround us: what's gotten us to this point, and sort of what's your hope or lack thereof for the future?
So there is a growing skepticism of things that are big. Big companies, big government. Big is seen as bad. And the reality is that we are a society that's dominated by big institutions. And so you've got this disconnect in that our society is run through these large enterprises, and yet confidence in large enterprises is at an all-time low. I do have hope, however. Great thing is that when you work with college students, they're idealistic, and they sort of renew your confidence that the world can actually change. And my great hope, I think, is that we're seeing, especially among this current generation of young people, a real desire to use their gifts, their abilities, and their talents to not just sort of serve their own purposes. And you can see this by the rise of tremendous interest in what I would call sort of socially responsible businesses, or sort of the professionalization of the nonprofit sector, the enormous interest in initiatives like Teach for America. I mean, these are things that are really making a positive difference. Talented young people who could be making a lot more money, choosing to not do that and to pursue something that they really believe in the cause. This is a cause-driven generation of young people. And that's a good, hopeful sign. I'm pretty bullish on where things are going.
Disclaimer for my question, I am a pastor, so I'm wondering, did you interview any religious leaders in your study, and did you find any unique answers that they might have given to your questions and their challenges of leading, obviously, because, I resonate with your idea of leading from the bottom up, but it's very challenging.
Yeah, I'll tell you a funny story. So when I was working on this earlier book called Faith in the Halls of Power, a friend of mine called me and said, I don't know if you've heard, but there's going to be a reception atop 30 Rockefeller Plaza. It's a party being held in the Rainbow Room, being thrown by Rupert Murdoch. And I said, oh, who's it for? And he said, Rick Warren. I said, well, that's kind of interesting. Tell me the story. He said, well, actually, Rick Warren wrote this book, The Purpose-Driven Life, and they're going to celebrate the 20 millionth copy being sold, breaking all-time record in publishing history. And he said, do you want to go? And I said, let me get this right. You got Rupert Murdoch is throwing a party for a Southern Baptist from Orange County, California, atop 30 Rockefeller Plaza in Midtown Manhattan. He said, yeah, that's right. I said, I'll be there. It's a very interesting interview, a very interesting party, because you had two different groups. You had the sort of religious friends of Rick Warren, and then you had the publishing elite of New York. And they mixed like water and oil. So it was so funny. And people were always trying to figure out which camp you were in. And so I'm sitting there, eating some cheese and crackers, and this woman comes up to me, and we're talking, and I said I was in Princeton. And so she automatically assumed that I was sort of in the this publishing crowd. And she said, you know, this is the most interesting group of people I've ever seen. And I said, oh, really? And she said, yes, do you know any of these evangelicals? And I said, well, yes, I think I do. And she said, I'd love to meet one. And so I turned to a friend of mine who was an evangelical who had gone to Yale. And I knew she had told me she went to Yale. And so I introduced her to a guy named Mark Berner. And I said, Mark, I want you to meet. And we made this introduction. And as they were talking, I turned, and as I was turning my shoulder, she said, so are there many evangelicals at Yale these days? And that was sort of, so that's how I opened my book with that particular question. Because I looked at the ways in which people of faith have been involved in different circles. And the interesting story is that the campuses of Harvard, Yale, Princeton have had a rise of more sort of religiously devout people over the last 20 years than really has been there in 100 years. And the reason is because you have more racial and ethnic and regional diversity among these student bodies, and in the process you've also created religious diversity. And so it's very interesting. I did interview a number of different religious leaders. Rick Warren happens to be one of them. I interviewed megachurch pastors, folks who lead religious nonprofit organizations. Some of them were really hard to get to. I actually found it easier to get an interview with Condi Rice than I did with Andy Stanley. So there are different people that I found along the way were particularly challenging, but had a really fun time hearing their stories. And many of them lead large enough enterprises that they really resonate with all of these same kind of stories and issues.
One more question? We have time for one more. Excellent.
Actually, this is a little off topic, but I take it that that's your computer?
Actually, it's not.
Oh.
I am fortunately borrowing Matt's computer. This is a technology accomplishment. That is an application called Prezi, which has to be loaded onto your computer. However, they have an online version, which I have never presented with in my life. And we don't have the wireless password for this particular room. So Matt tied up his iPhone, which is allowing us to tether a wireless connection through his iPhone, and we're running Prezi off the internet. So, but I learned the application from my students. Prezi is this great application, so it's like PowerPoint, you know, squared. And you get to do all these kind of animations and different things like that. So.
Well, then I'm going to have to congratulate Matt for mentoring people in Financial Peace University there, which is an absolutely fabulous.
And use
so
all the slide that was up here as we were beginning. Yeah, that's exactly right. Listen, it's been great here being with you all. Thank you very much.